Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, well, hey, thanks for joining. This office hours is just our standard office hours. Next week is going to be the one where we announce new features. So this is kind of just an open format. This is for any community members that want to ask questions or talk about things, present things. So Daniel, why don't you share a little bit about how long you've been in the OPA community? I don't think I've seen your name before, and so kind of just tell us what you're using OPA for.
Yeah, this is my first time attending one of these. I've been in the Slack channel on and off, but yeah, I work at a company called Cloudflare, and we're using OPA internally for basically internal tool authorization. And yeah, we've been using it for about a year and a half maybe now for that purpose, and it's been suiting us great. Definitely, there's so many cool things that you can do with this tool. So one of the things I'm really interested to learn is about the partial evaluation functionality and how to really explore that in terms of when you don't have all the context at the time of the request, how can you authorize later on so that once you get more data about more context about what the user is actually trying to do and what data that they're operating upon, how you can even limit that authorization more so that it's really that they're working on the minimal subset of data that they're allowed to work on and nothing more. But yeah, that's my story with OPA so far, and yeah, just happy to be here. Cool.
Thanks for sharing, Daniel. I see a couple other names on here. Oh, Roy, I know that name. And then Wes also sounds like a new name. But yeah, why don't we start with Roy? Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi guys, I'm Roy Schwaber-Cohen. I'm a developer advocate at Assert. Assert uses OPA very heavily for our decision engine, and I'm here to just learn from everybody and hear about the latest and greatest features of OPA, and sometimes share some of our own developments in using OPA. That's it.
Cool, thanks, Roy. And then Wes, do you feel like sharing?
Yeah, hey, this is Wes. I work in security engineering at a large financial services company. We use OPA mostly for the normal Terraform validation as well as Kubernetes for different services.
Cool, awesome. And then Wes or Daniel, did you guys have any, I guess that Daniel said you have the partial evaluation question. Philip, oh yeah, so Philip, why don't you introduce yourself then?
Yeah, so my name is Philip Conrad. I work on the OPA team alongside Peter and several other folks at Styra. Yeah, I work mostly on the deep internals of the compiler and a lot of the built-ins. So I think some of the most recent built-ins I've worked with include the new GraphQL related built-ins and attempting to extend those a bit. One of the things that's been on my mind lately is performance improvements for some of the fundamental data types in the language, like objects and sets. And so that's something that I think we're going to be pursuing a little bit in the future, is figuring out what operations can we accelerate on those, and yeah, just little performance improvements on memory and speed here and there. There are still some low-hanging bits of fruit on the tree, and so yeah, I'm excited about that kind of stuff for the future. I'm dropping into office hours mostly just because, well, I try to make it to these because I really like to see what are people actually using OPA for in the community, right? And, depending on the use cases that I see cropping up, that helps me internally weight the priority of things that come up on the issue tracker and things on our roadmap. So if we see a ton of people really care about a particular use case, that helps us figure out what should we be caring about, Yeah. So I'm just here to back up Peter as necessary, because there may be a few topics that I know that he doesn't, and there's a lot of topics that Peter is much more knowledgeable on than me currently. So yeah.
Well, Philip, but why don't you kick us off? What do you know about partial evaluation?
Oh goodness.
From there.
So partial evaluation in OPA is the idea that partial evaluation as a compiler technique is the idea that when possible, you want to plug in constant values into places, right? You want to grind through as much of the work for a function or piece of code as you can. And so where possible, you want to plug in actual hard values for as many spots as you can, in the belief that this will save you memory fetches later, or this will save you having to recompute things later. So this ties in nicely to how OPA will memoize heavily on queries. It's not memorize, although it sounds really similar, and the two concepts are kind of related. But essentially, when you use the partial evaluation features, which I haven't had a lot of time to play around with them since I joined Styra, but my understanding of them is that they change your queries just slightly and attempt to, where possible, on paths that would always hit a certain value or would always evaluate a certain way, they'll reduce it down and trim out tautologies where, something is always going to be true. And we'll plug in, constants where possible. Essentially, that's what they do. It might be smarter than that. Because I know Stefan and Johan have been working on making partial eval smarter in recent memory. So
yeah, and like I think Torin did the first draft of it, and like came out with a lot of like the big sweeping changes. But then yeah, now we've just been doing like smaller improvements to it. But yeah, Daniel, did you have any specific questions about it, or just like this generally chatting about it?
Yeah, I had some questions about it. I guess maybe if it's helpful, I could just describe the use case of like where I'm kind of looking at this. And so
Sure.
I've read Torrent's blog about this when he wrote it in like 2018, I think, about basically. So for our use case, we have this internal API gateway. It's for operating on internal objects at this company, and only certain users are authorized to operate on certain objects. So it's the basic OSV story, which is like you can have some groups, be a member of some groups, and you can act upon some objects, like resource to action pairs is how we're referring to them. I'm so sorry, my dog is barking.
All good.
What's that? Yeah, so basically, yeah, you can act upon certain resources. And so that stuff is simple. Like I have this group that is allowed to act upon this resource. That's simple. Where it gets a little bit more complex is that, we're only operating at the time of the request at the API gateway level. So we really don't have all the information. Like, for example, one of the things that we're looking at right now is like restricting some of these actions based on geographic location. So say I'm someone who's in a country like India or something like that. I really should only operate on resources that are available to an Indian employee, for example. And partial evaluation, I think, has kind of piqued my interest here because one of the things we don't know is like, say I'm listing a certain set of resources. I could be getting all sorts of data coming back, and some of it could be available for Indian employees to use, some of it couldn't be. But at the time of the request, we don't really know that. Like you're asking for something and we don't know what's going to get returned back from the database. So what I've seen in that blog post is that basically partial evaluation can say like, here are the computed knowns. Like we can know if you're in a certain API group that's allowed to do this operation. Like we can compute that, figure that out. And then what I want to get to is a place where now all the unknowns that we have are like, okay, you're acting on a list of resources. We don't really know what those list of resources is. We only want to allow you to act on a certain subset of those resources that are returned from the database. How can we take the OPA policy that is returned from the compile API, which is like that limited set of like, you're only allowed to act upon certain resources. How can we turn that into a SQL query and try to evaluate that closer to where the data is actually fetched and returned, so that we're not giving you access to more data than you really should have. If that makes sense. I apologize, I was speaking for a while there. So
no. So that's interesting. Peter, you got any thoughts there?
Yeah, it sounds like a good use case. Yeah, like in that multi-stage like fetching of data. Yeah, I haven't tried that myself, so it might be a question for Tor, and I could probably, yeah, I mean, like this office hours is recorded, so I could probably get him to like chime in on it since you've already like asked the question here and see if he can just write something up. He knows it obviously way better than probably myself or Philip here.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
but yeah, I think it sounds like you should be able to build something around that. But yeah,
in the absolute worst case scenario, OPA does have an IR format, which we have seen people build compilers, or I guess transpilers, whatever you want to call them, that ingest the IR and then spit out something equivalent in a different language. That's kind of the heavyweight solution though. And if you can get away with something that doesn't require you to build your own tool chain, that's probably what you want. But
Yeah.
there is that escape hatch if none of the existing tooling can get you there. I guess for your use case, is it when resources are created, do you know the geo segment they belong to?
So we're actually working on that internally right now. So we do have data pipelines. Like we're approaching an initial approach for this. We're like basically the first pass is that we have a static list, so we can just feed that into OPA as like a YAML file or something like that. That's
Right.
fine. Eventually, we would like to get to the case where we're like filling in this data in real time. So like there's going to be like a Redis cache, or it might be an actual relational database. But we'll have that geographic information so that OPA can at least like at the time of the request, we can maybe overload the input and pass it in. But it still doesn't get us to the place where like when we're acting upon things that we don't know what the API will return just because the data is not available at that time. That's where we're looking into this partial evaluation feature, because it's just something that we don't know, and short of like feeding it the actual response of like what these queries could be, which is like not feasible. That's kind of where we're looking into.
Right. Like the easiest solution would be if you, I guess if you knew, the geotagging for each of your resources that matter. I don't know the cardinality of your set here. Like, is this like 100 resources, this 100K resources? Is this 1 million or more? And depending on how many you're dealing with, if you can tag them at time of generation, that's something you could easily like build into a bundle as, a data.json file or a YAML file and run. And that would get you by at least temporarily. But depending on what your API returns, you could choose to reject untagged resources if you went that route, and just, that you would have to do some filtering of whatever comes back from your API, but you could run it through the policy, and anything that doesn't have a tag on it, you just assume is restricted. That would get you part of the way there, right?
Yes.
But I think the full solution, I personally don't have enough experience with partial evaluation to be very helpful here. So we'll ping Torin after this.
Yeah, and I actually I have a quick playground too I can send to the chat of like what.
oh, perfect.
That is perfect.
Yeah. And you were mentioning like the set implementation. I'm definitely interested in that as well, because currently we've not been using set operations to the fullest capability, and if there's any like performance enhancements there too, that's awesome to hear. But I will send that in the chat. I'm sure other folks might have questions too, so I don't want to monopolize the time here.
Cool. I'll move on to Wes. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so I have a kind of a high level question with OPA, and really it's around how do you assert that a service is sending a request to OPA? Because you have this implicit trust that one, it sends it to OPA, and then two, that when it gets the response back, it actually utilizes that response. So is there any type of thinking around assertions?
I guess can you give us a little bit about how you've deployed OPA? Are you running it as like a sidecar? Are you running it like as like a Go module? Like what's the current implementation?
Most of them are services. The CI/CDs are evals, but we're switching those over to execs so that we have the full, basically the control plane is the same across CI/CD and for services, but mostly just services.
Okay, so OPA is running just like as a standalone deployment that you're sending queries to?
Right.
Okay, and then so you're querying from what is your CI/CD pipeline? What tool set are you using?
It's just like Docker containers that basically invoke OPA.
Okay.
So,
Go ahead.
oh, so if I understand your question correctly, what you're asking is there a way to check that a service is actually querying OPA? Is that right?
Yeah, it's basically like I send a request to OPA and then I get a response back. I would
Right.
assume that I could sign that response that asserts that whatever I got was only from this particular OPA service, and then that I could validate it further down the line and do some type of cross-checking that every request I have made has been signed.
Interesting. So that's a tricky one because this is like similar but distinctly different from the idea of decision logging, which if you look at the logs on the running like OPA server, you'll see that you get like a decision ID for every single query that comes in. The problem is the decision ID, I don't know that we actually return that in the response.
I don't think we do. It might be programmable to, like, you might be able to grab that though. Like because
Let
you
me
can
actually double check that.
because you can hit
Or
the
like-
management API for it, right? And so I would imagine that it is grab, like you could grab it in some format. And then I wonder, like, comparing that to just your to just like the number of queries that you've given might be able to give you some way to do the comparison.
Or if you went full open telemetry and had OPA as a span and you add the decision log to that span, you could easily link requests between them.
Yeah.
So one option, does the verification, does it need to happen at the clients, or are you fine just doing the verification offline overall?
We can do it offline and just like reconcile and say, hey, this is a red flag. But it's basically for like auditing purposes down the road that assert that every request that went in was validated.
Okay. So the decision logging format actually does include the inputs.
Yeah.
So that is one option, is like each of your services could include an extra JSON field and that would get logged. Now proving that the service did anything with the decision that it got back, that's a lot harder to prove unless the service is logging what it did with the results. That's kind of a trusting trust thing, right? You've shipped the package and then what the person does with the package is up to them, right? So I guess some combination of logging for your individual services and using the decision logs from OPA is probably going to be, there's some combination there that probably could work for your use case. Off the top of my head, I don't know of something, out of box that solves the whole problem all in one go.
Okay. And I wasn't expecting, it's a pretty abstract question.
Okay. Cool, but Wes, if you do test it out with open telemetry, that would be pretty cool to kind of share with the community. So I'd be happy to review whatever you do create and see how it looks.
Yeah, I've been digging into the decision logs recently and wrote up a quick Python server to parse all of them.
Cool. And then Daniel, you made a comment here, might be off here, but decision ID does return from the data query API.
Yeah, and I'm sorry because that might not be exactly what you're looking for, but I do know that you can get, when you ask OPA about the state of the system with the V1 data, whatever the document is that you're asking about, the decision ID can be returned if decision logs are enabled. But it sounds like you're not using that. It sounds like you're using the eval type of API first. So anyways, yeah, that might not be relevant. Just listing that out there.
Cool. Thanks for the input though. All right. Yeah, and Daniel, I see the playground link here. So thanks for that.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll do some digging with Torrin on the partial eval stuff, and then Wes, is there anything that we could specifically look up for you? Or do you think you can run with this with the open telemetry idea, and then we can just reconnect either at the next office hours or in Slack?
Yeah, we'll do that, and we'll reconnect with the open telemetry.
Perfect. Sounds great.
All right.
Cool. Yeah, we got 5 minutes left. If anyone else has any questions.
The only other question that I have here is that, so you have that contrib repo that shows the different ideas here. So I've seen people who have taken the responses from the compile API. I know Torrent did an example of turning those into SQL via Python implementation. I've seen a TypeScript implementation of this. I was wondering, in terms of Golang, I'm assuming OPA already has some sort of Golang AST parser, because that's how the language itself is built, right? It's built in Go. Like,
So are you referring to something that takes like the IR output and compiles it?
yeah, because that just to be, maybe I'm not understanding. The compile API returns the IR output, does it not?
I don't think it does by default.
Okay.
I think it returns the AST.
Okay, it returns the AST. Sorry,
Right.
and that's, yeah.
So we have this tension, right? We have at runtime, we construct, like during parsing, we construct this large AST structure, and then where possible, we plug in constants, and we have like some holes in the tree for where references and things go. When you go to evaluate a policy, we actually plug in all of those spots in a recursive procedure. It's surprisingly fast, mostly because where recursion is needed, it tends to be like direct links to the spot that needs to be filled in through like a callback chain system. I looked at it at first and it was a confusing structure, but it's fairly close to optimal for what they're trying to do, to support like actual like unification and other like logic language concepts. The problem is that isn't exactly how most people are used to languages working. Like we're used to there being like an IR format or a bytecode format, right? Where it's a linear sequence of operations that's easier to reason about. And so the IR format attempts to distill down all of those, tree shaking operations into a linear stream of like assignments and calls to built-ins, basically. And so a lot of people seem to find that very useful for compilation purposes. I think there's at least one like JVM project that I'm aware of where somebody took the IR and then they actually compile it and do things with it. So
This is returning me. I had a college class about like language, language construction and all the different forms, and micro scheme and all that stuff. So I'm gonna have to go back into my notes from a long time ago.
I still occasionally dig up my notes from like compilers class and algorithms and stuff because there's some fun bits in there. Yeah. So yeah. All right. Any other questions?
Cool. Well, hey, thanks for joining, everyone. And yeah, we'll chat soon. Have a good one. Bye.
All right. Take care.